this is the kind of the curse of the autocrat, is that you're never told the truth because you don't want to hear the truth, and the truth is unpalatable, and so you're also deeply suspicious and paranoid and so on and so forth. So none of those are good circumstances in which to make the best decisions.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I welcome the author and historian James Holland. His new book, Cassino 44, The Brutal Battle for Rome. This is a story that needs retelling. I first realized of Monte Cassino when I was very young, and there was a black and white presentation on television in Philadelphia of the destruction of Monte Cassino, and it was presented as a debate held by the Allies about what needs to be done. I don't remember clearly what the resolution was. However, now that I've read James's book and studied the matter, the debate was secondary to what else was going on, which was a massacre of all sides in the terrain that was forbidding to begin with, but it was wintertime. So I begin this conversation with the big picture. Why Italy? Given we know now the battle was going to be won in mainland Europe after Normandy, why Italy kept on? James, congratulations and good evening. What was Overlord and what was Italy to Overlord? The thinking at the command level, Churchill, FDR, Marshall, and Alexander. Good evening.
Good evening, and thank you very much for having me back on, John. It's good to see you. So at the end of the Sicilian campaign in August 1943, by that time there was a huge amount of men, warships, airplanes in the Mediterranean. And at that point, it looked like D-Day, Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion from England to France, was going to be in May 1944. So that was quite a long time to be kind of doing nothing, no major operations. However much it was important to kind of properly prepare for Normandy. And it was thought that actually we could really help Normandy by going into Italy, because that way you would draw off German troops, because if Italy was out of the war, which was what would happen, you get Italy out of the war, then you have, then you invade the mainland of Italy, the main leg of Italy. Either the Germans have to abandon it, or they've got to occupy it. And if they occupy it, they're not just occupying Italy, they're also occupying the Balkans and Greece, which were occupied by Italian troops up until September 1943, when Italy gets out of the war. So that's good, because that means you're drawing away lots of German troops. The other thing is that you can, and by drawing away German troops, you're kind of whittling away at German strength. And then the other thing, which is a really crucial bit, and probably the key to the understanding the whole Italian campaign, is you can capture the airfield area at Foggia, around Foggia, which is about a third of the way up on the eastern side. And that's really important, because from there you can further tighten the strategic air noose around Germany. You can bomb from, with the mighty the 8th Air Force from East Anglia in England, and with the RAF Bomber Command, but you can also bomb aircraft factories, particularly in the Southern Reich, from Foggia, from Italy. So what's not to like about that? And of course you can capture Rome, and that would be a good psychological thing to do as well. So those were the main reasons for doing it. And that was all great, because by the end of September 1943, Germany had occupied Italy. They had pulled into Balkans and Greece to the tune of about 50 divisions, which, if you think each division is about 15,000 men, that's quite a lot. That's a big commitment. And the Allies had captured the Foggia airfields, all of which was very good. The problem is you're doing this in a very mountainous terrain in winter. And Hitler, who had originally indicated that he was thinking of withdrawing troops to the Pisa-Rimini line, which is about 200 miles north of Rome, should the Allies invade, then changed his mind and decided to fight for every yard south of Rome instead, which is very much his kind of modus operandi, which then consigned the Allies to a kind of dark, bleak winter where they were battling against the Germans, who were refusing to give any ground in unspeakably unfavorable conditions.
We begin with the two commanders who make all the decisions arduously through this conflict. One is Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, but most important to me is Sir Harold Alexander, the overall commander of both the Eighth Army at the Adriatic and the Fifth Army in driving on Rome. What do we
Yeah.
need to know about Alexander, called by everyone Alex?
Well, I actually think he's one of the most significant Allied armies of the entire war. He's got a kind of sort of lucky charm to him, really. I mean, he's incredibly experienced. He's the only senior commander on any side in the Second World War to have commanded troops in battle at every single rank. And he's also the only Allied commander to commanded German troops as well, which he did in the Baltic when he commanded the Baltic Landwehr against the Russians in 1919. So he's hugely experienced, and has a proven track record of winning. So he was the last man out of Dunkirk, so he oversaw the successful evacuation of the entire British Expeditionary Force in 1940. He managed to bring the British forces in Burma back across the mighty river Irrawaddy safely into India in early part of 1942. When he arrived to take over as commander-in-chief of the Middle East in August 1942, he immediately stopped the rot. The British never went backwards another yard and only went forwards. And when he became Army Group Commander in Tunisia in February 1943, again, the Allies started to turn things around in pretty quick order and won the biggest victory up to that point that the Allies had achieved in the European War by May 1943. He was then Army Group Commander for Sicily, and that was won in 38 days. And so he was then Army Group Commander in Italy, and he was a very, very good diplomat. He was extremely charming. He was a good coalition commander. He had a very great lightness of touch. Everyone liked him. He was very smart, spoke 7 languages, and of course had vast amounts of experience. So he was a really, really good person to have in that situation.
Montgomery had been pulled out of the Eighth Army and gone back to get ready to command the ground forces for Normandy. Mm-hmm. A general named Leese takes over the Eighth Army. But the most important figure here for this telling is Mark Clark, a friend and ally and classmate of Dwight Eisenhower. But Mark Clark has never commanded troops in combat. Is that correct?
No, that's not entirely correct, because he did as a young junior officer in 1917, 1918 in France, and did very well. And he's an exceptional planner, an exceptional operational commander. What I mean by that is someone, he understands the kind of logistical constraints of armies. He's a details person. He dots his I's, crosses his T's. He's incredibly thorough, but he's also, although he'd never commanded an army in battle before Salerno, the invasion of Salerno in September 1943, he did a really, really good job there. I mean, you can't really fault him. He got across the river Volturno, which was another difficult object in October 1943, got his Fifth Army up to there's a sort of double lock system of defensive lines south of Rome. The first one is the Bernhard line, or the Winter line, as the Americans tend to call it, and then second, the Gustav line. And he burst through the Bernhard line before Christmas 1943 in exceptionally difficult conditions, where the playing field was very much kind of leveled for both sides, because the huge advantage that the Allies had in air power and mechanization was kind of negated by very bad weather and the mountains and so on, and the kind of mud in the valleys. And the truth is that by January 1944, there was not a single American commander alive. He was commanding so many different nationalities, and certainly no one in Europe that was commanding a larger army. So the challenges and responsibilities on his shoulder were absolutely immense. And frankly, he gets an awful lot more right than he gets wrong.
I'm speaking to James Holland. The new book is Cassino 44, The Brutal Battle for Rome, and we will begin the battle with an attack by the British under Mark Clark. The battle for Rome begins by challenging the German Gustav Line, the Winter Line, which runs through the mountainous territory as you approach Rome. The biggest mountain of all is Monte Cassino. It towers above what is called the Liri Valley. The Liri Valley is cut through by something very famous if you've ever read Rome. It's called the Via Appia, Route 7. Route 6 goes along the shoreline. they choose Route 7, which is the tougher road given Monte Cassino, and not 6. Why is that, James? Why didn't they take...
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to correct you there, John. It's 7 is the Via Appia, which is
I
on
will,
the coast,
yes.
and the Via Casalina is Highway 6, which is the one that runs
Yes,
through.
I got them backwards. 7 is on the coast.
Yeah, but that doesn't matter. But I mean, the point is, there's the four major roads running up through the leg of Italy, and the Via Casalina, Highway 6, is the one that goes through the town of Cassino, and above it is towering Monte Cassino, and behind that is Monte Caro, which is 6,000 foot high and even bigger. But the Monte Cassino Massive is overlooking the town and overlooking the road and overlooking the Liri Valley. But that's got the widest scope for maneuver, and so it's the easiest one to navigate. But the problem is because it kind of hugs the foot of the mountains, German observers up on the mountains can watch every single move, and you simply can't move an army through the Liri Valley while the Germans are in the high ground above you, overlooking you, because they're directing artillery fire onto that road, and you need the arteries, these roads, to kind of get your mechanization, your trucks and your supplies and men and material and all the rest of it up northwards. So you've got to get that. And of course, the observers up on the mountains are protected by infantry, who are in turn protected by machine guns and mortars and more artillery. And so fighting up a mountain and then winkling out the enemy from their strong positions and hidden positions of defense and their weapons is a really, really difficult task in winter. That's the challenge facing Mark Clark, whose Fifth Army is covering this part of the line.
The battle kicks off by crossing a river under fire by the British. Is it the whole 10th Corps, just a piece of the 10th Corps going across?
Yeah, no, it's two divisions, so it's the 5th and the 56th with a few supplementary forces. But the idea that Mark Clark has is what he's going to do is he's going to hit the Gustav line in a series of coordinated attacks. First, the British on the Garigliano down by the coast. This is British 10 Corps. Then there's going to be the British 46th Division are going to cross the Garigliano a little bit further up towards Cassino. And then the 36th Texan Division are going to cross the River Rapido, which runs into the Garigliano, just a couple of miles south of Cassino. And that'll be the third attack. And at the same time, the French Expeditionary Corps, which are also under Clark's command, are going to do attacks up into the north. So there's a series of attacks, all of which will put the German positions under huge amount of pressure. That's the idea.
The attack across the rivers is challenging because the Germans are prepared for it, and they've been dug in with mortars and heavy artillery and machine guns as the British cross. And then the Americans attempt the same thing at a place called the Rapido. There's several rivers there. So it's a broad front, but it does not succeed, or does it? Because it does engage the enemy. What were they expecting?
Yeah, well, it doesn't succeed in the way that they don't get the big breakthrough that they're hoping for, but it certainly draws off German troops, and it certainly absolutely batters them. I mean, they might not have seen it like this because the Germans' line didn't crumble, but the Germans were absolutely at breaking point, and the casualties they were taking was just horrific. And that's not to say that the Allied casualties weren't awful as well. They were truly horrific. I mean, so in the south, by the sea, British 10 Corps do manage to get across the Garigliano. They do push the Germans back. They do get onto the high ground overlooking it. They just can't get the complete breakthrough. The 42nd Division attack doesn't work at all because the flow of the river is too fast and too high. And the Texans just don't use the assets that Clark and Jeffrey Keyes, the Corps commander, have given to them. So they have something like 350 Sherman tanks and tank destroyers, which are high velocity guns on tracked vehicles, all of which have been handed over to them to use as in a fire suppressing role as well as an exploitation role. And Fred Walker, the Texas division commander, just doesn't use any of them. And so the 36th Division, the Texans are repulsed rather sort of bloodily. A huge number are taken prisoner. And it doesn't work. But again, it's important to stress that this does put enormous strain on the German position.
The German position, important to mention, Kesselring, the overall commander, and their two armies, the 10th and the 14th. Von Mackensen commands I believe the 14th. But behind them all is Hitler, who is amazingly, everywhere I confront him in your books, he manages to contribute in a way that makes it easy eventually for the Allies to win. It might be just I'm reading the wrong parts, but he interferes in the wrong direction all the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to remember that this is a guy who's never been to staff college. He doesn't know best, but he's surrounded by sycophants. He's surrounded by yes men, people who tell him what he wants to hear. So, this is the kind of the curse of the autocrat, is that you're never told the truth because you don't want to hear the truth, and the truth is unpalatable, and so you're also deeply suspicious and paranoid and so on and so forth. So none of those are good circumstances in which to make the best decisions. And as I say, the truth is, he was a junior non-commissioned officer in the First World War. He had no real military experience, has no staff training whatsoever. And he makes terrible decisions, and it's an absolutely terrible decision to stay south of Rome from a German perspective, because it just makes no sense. Because okay, you lose Rome, but that's small beer at this stage of the war, where the net is closing around Nazi Germany. They're losing, and a much more sensible solution would have been to retreat to the Pisa-Rimini line, which is about 200 miles north of Rome, and where the mountains kiss the coast either side, in a pretty much uninterrupted way, making it a very, very strong defensive position. Because the bottom line is they've already given up the Foggia airfields, which is the most important strategic bit of real estate in Italy, the previous September. So there's no reason to fight south, and all you're doing is extending your lines of supply, which are being harried by Allied aircraft and all the rest of it. And they're very short of fuel, they're very short of everything. So shorten your lines of supply and bed in the mountains, and then they would have lost far fewer men and would have had men to go onto the Eastern Front or Western Front or whatever. So it's a kind of an own goal, but obviously if you're an Allied soldier battling through the mountains, or you're a Texan trying to get across the Rapido, you're not seeing it like that. You're thinking, this corner of Italy that I'm in is absolutely hellish. The rain's coming down, it's freezing cold, it's dark and miserable, and everyone's shooting at me.
Before we go to Shingle, Kesselring, is he in place because he's a yes man? Is that his job?
Yeah, well, he's just sort of evolved there. I mean, he was a very good sort of diplomat in the years where the Germans were allies with the Italians, and but again, he's a Luftwaffe field marshal, not an army field marshal, and he's doing a ground role. And literally every senior German commander by the beginning of February 1944 is saying, we need to retreat, we need to pull back. He is the only one who's saying, no, 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 the Fuhrer says I've got to fight for every yard, so therefore we must all fight for every single yard. It just makes militarily very, very poor judgment, I would say.
Going to Operation Shingle. James Holland is the author. Casino 44 is the book. The Brutal Battle for Rome. This is war. This is not Hollywood. And there is a decision made to land behind the German line at a beach we call Anzio, but it was called Operation Shingle. It's important now to engage in why Shingle and the debate about how long they could have landing craft and what kind of forces they could get on shore. Because the idea here is to outflank the Germans and make them break their Gustav, the winter line. But, James, the landings go forward, but there's a struggle about landing craft, especially big ones. I understand there's another operation called Anvil. What was the debate?
Well, the whole big problem is that there just aren't enough landing craft. The big kind of period of landing craft building runs between May 1942 and April 1943, in which the Americans alone built 8,713 landing craft of various sizes. One has to remember that the kind of first landing craft aren't even being in production until kind of late 1940, early 1941. I mean, the Higgins boat, the famous Higgins boat built by down in New Orleans, which we're all familiar with from D-Day and so on. That wasn't first trial till May 1941. And of course, by the summer of 1943 and into the winter of 43-44, Allied commitments around the world are absolutely enormous. There's a massive Pacific War going on, which is far bigger than anyone had ever anticipated back in, the time of Pearl Harbor or before Pearl Harbor. And you're preparing for D-Day, which is the main event and which has to be properly supported. And there's just not enough to go around. And after May 1943, production had to return to making warships and freighters and all the rest of it. So there's only, even in the United States, and Britain combined, there is a sort of limited capacity. So that's the problem with it. And there's only enough landing craft and the all important landing ships, which you mentioned, which are these big landing ships, which, are like 120 yards long. There's only enough to do a limited operation, and that's not guaranteed success. It's got nothing to do with Mark Clark. It's got nothing to do with Alexander. They can only do what they can do with what they've been given. The reason there is so much demand is because of the Pacific, because of the demands of Operation Overlord, which is coming up, and which has been postponed to June 1944, not May 1940 as originally planned. And then there is subsequently going to be a plan which is sort of, at the time in January 1942 is supposed to take place at the same time as Operation Overlord, which is going to be Operation Anvil, which later becomes Operation Dragoon, which is invasion of southern France. So, there's a lot of demands on very limited amount of shipping. And of course, these ships, every time they're not just landing on D-Day, they're not on the day of an invasion, they're being used all day, every day for the campaign. And every time they land, they're hitting the beach. And every time they hit the beach, they might just jolt something or knock something out of shape. So they're having wear and tear. They're made very simply and very lightly. So the damage comes around quite quickly. And you have to factor in time to repair them as well. And move them from A to B, move them from the Mediterranean to the Pacific or to London, to southern England or wherever they need to be, or Corsica or whatever. So it's a huge, huge challenge. And the problem with Anzio is there's enough to make it a spirited operation and make it kind of worthwhile down the road, but there isn't enough to really make a decisive impact that's going to break the Gustav line at the time it's launched.
The landing goes forward under a general named Lucas. This is the Sixth Corps, and we need to understand Lucas to know what happens next. He looks like a man who is very capable, but at the same time, he comes under criticism from both Alexander and Clark for not being aggressive enough. What is it they faulted him for?
Yeah, he just isn't. I mean, he's just not aggressive enough. He's a naturally kind of defensive kind of guy, and he's thinking to himself, I can't have a massive reversal where my Sixth Corps, which is part of Clark's Fifth Army, gets shoved back into the sea by a massive German counterattack. So he's being kind of pushed by Alexander and Clark to be aggressive and expand the bridgehead further and get into the kind of Alban Hills where they've got a little bit of high ground. But all the time he's thinking, well, it's all very well you saying that to me, but I can't risk having a reverse here. And the truth is, it's a bit like Walker at the Rapido. He's given quite a lot of armor and he's given quite a lot of guns and he's given naval support as well. And he is not confident enough to be able to use that to its maximum capability. And his caution works against him because by the time he is in a finally forced to kind of go on the offensive there, the Germans have responded so fully that they're vastly outnumbering the Allied forces in the Anzio bridgehead. And of course, it doesn't really come to anything. And it's not that he's bad, it's just that he's the wrong man for that role. And the problem is there aren't that many American generals to choose from, and you can't just keep sacking them left, right, and center if they don't kind of do exactly what you say. So they're kind of slightly stuck with him. He's the only person around who can do this job, and he's just not aggressive enough. So But Anzio is not a complete waste of time because it does draw off lots of German troops from the Gustav line. It does draw a huge commitment from the German 14th Army to try and push the Allies back into the sea. And obviously later on in the campaign, in the final battle for Rome, it's absolutely invaluable that they have this launch pad for a further strike. So it's not completely wasted. Again, it's just try telling that to the kind of the GI or the Tommy that's on the ground facing this kind of onslaught.
They're on shore at Anzio, behind the German lines. Kesselring is very, very anxious about landings like Anzio or another one north of Rome. But this is when they launch the Red Bulls, that's the 34th Infantry Division, across the flooded out region before Monte Cassino, and they come in from the north, James. They're
just north of the town. Yeah, just north of the town, and I mean it's a horror story. But fortunately for the Red Bulls, at that point, because of the battles that have already taken place, against British Ten Corps and the Garigliano, against the Texans. and because of Operation Shingle, the invasion of Anzio, the line at Monte Cassino is incredibly thinly held by a very the 44th Infantry, German 44th Infantry Division, which has been absolutely hammered since it first arrived on the front back in November 1943. So they are able to eventually get across the upper Rapido Valley, which is this waterlogged valley. They are able to get up into the foothills and then kind of start pushing up onto the Monte Cassino Massif. And it looks like they've got the whole thing in their hands. But just at that moment, Monte Cassino itself, the mountain overlooking the Liri Valley and the Rapido Valley and the town itself, is reinforced, and it's reinforced just enough. So although to the Texans, it looks like they're already got the breakthrough and they're so close they can almost touch the Liri Valley on the far side of the Monte Cassino Massif. In actual fact, they might as well be 100 miles away because the Germans are about to dig in.
Yes, they dig in and they're going to turn Monte Cassino into a fortress, which is already a fortress. We need to mention that right now. Yeah. This is associated with the Holy Catholic Church and Rome. However, it was built, in the 6th century, somewhere during some time. Yes. And
so this is the Benedictine Monastery, and it's not supposed to be part of the battle zone, and it's been agreed that there'll be a wide exclusion zone all around it, which the Germans have ignored. The Germans are not using the monastery itself, but they're using the ground around it, and it lies on a kind of sort of raised, perched knoll at the end of the Monte Cassino Massif. So you might as well be in it. And obviously it's the Germans who choose to put the Gustav line defenses straight through the middle of it. No one else chose that. But it's the whole massive is the problem is the strongest part of the German defenses are at the end of the massive rather than kind of further up. But further up, if you're a ground control, if you're a ground commander at the time and you're looking up at it, you're thinking, well, the higher it is, that's the harder it's going to be. The wider the massive, we've got to cross over. I don't really fancy that. On the other hand, the further along the massive you go, the more thinly it's held. The defenses aren't so bad, and most crucially of all, there aren't as many gullies and fissures and hiding spots and ridges as there are on the end of the Monte Cassino Massif. So it's much easier to move larger numbers of troops further into the massif than it is right at the end of the massif where the monastery is perched.
The Red Bulls make a great deal of success right up until the middle of February when the offensive breaks down, but there's some important details here. It's behind the Monte Cassino that the battle will take place most vigorously. It's wintertime. They're climbing in wintertime, ice and snow, bodies all around them. It's a horrible landscape, but you make it very clear throughout the book that the commanders, Clark and Alexander and other commanders, don't go to the Mastiff. They don't visit it. They don't have a clean understanding of what the troops are crawling through.
Well, they just can't. It's just, it's a very, very narrow space, really. And right up on the top of the massif where the main fighting is taking place, you're right in the front zone. I mean, you can't have Clark or Alexander going up there and getting hit. The problem is the American Red Bulls, when they're attacking, they're being canalized down these ridgelines. And the ridgelines are pretty narrow, and that means you can only send, maybe a company at best at one time. And a company is, by the time you're actually in operations, is probably only about 100, 120 men tops. That's not very many. And the reason you can't send down more than that is because there isn't the space to move them safely. You need to be spaced apart. And of course, up in the mountains, the soil is very thin. So the explosive effect of a mortar round or a shell or whatever is much worse. It's exaggerated because not only are you getting bits of metal flying everywhere, you're also getting little razor sharp shards of stone. So it's incredibly difficult to do. And what happens is the one company goes forward, gets attacked, gets hammered, hits the deck, then another one goes forward, and exactly the same thing happens. The problem with that is it's the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants, and so on, and the junior officers, the lieutenants and first lieutenants, who are having to lead the men forward. And of course, they're in the front line of casualties, so they're unable to report what's going on. So there is a very confused picture in the detail of exactly how far they're getting and how successful they're being, and that just doesn't filter down properly to the people down in the valley below who are actually commanding the regiments, and corps and ultimately army.
There's a second attack beginning in the 15th of February, and we'll come to that in just a moment. But I wanted to mention that what I think digs in most on the defense of Monte Cassino is the Fallschirmjäger, used as troops by Kesselring and von Mackensen to fill holes. Who are they? What is their reputation, James?
Well, they're not particularly good by this point. They've got a hard cadre of very experienced men, junior officers and medium rank officers, and a few NCOs. But they're filled up with teenagers, sort of 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds and a few 17-year-olds. They're all German, which is not the same for a lot of German infantry divisions at this time. Most of whom are troops in German uniforms, which is not the same thing as being German. They're Czechs and Poles and Baltic states types and all the rest of it, and pulled from left, right, and centre, don't really want to be there. But the Fallschirmjäger are all German. They're much more motivated. And, teenagers will do exactly what you tell them to do. So they've got enough experience to make them kind of stand above the rest. But, these are, the first Fallschirmjäger division, which takes over the positions around Monte Cassino, you're only talking about 2,500 men. I mean, it is a fraction of what it should be. It should be about 16,000 men in total. So, and it's only 2,500. So that is how depleted it is. And it's depleted because they've just been overused and haven't had a chance to replenish. The other thing, of course, is it's much easier to defend than it is to attack. A 17-year or 18-year-old comes along and you go, oh, okay, Fritz, go and fetch me some more mortar shells. You have to go over there and watch me while I fire this mortar. This is what you do. And, you train them up in the process of just being at the front. So they're better than most German troops, but this idea that they're kind of super elite is just nonsensical. And really is another, the only reason they're so famous now is because of the huge number of photographs of Fallschirmjäger taken in Italy, and that is a deliberate policy by Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister.
The decision is made that Monte Cassino is the problem, and the decision is made to use the overwhelming Air Force to destroy it. But there's confusion about how to use the Air Force, what to bomb. Debate between the New Zealand commander and a British commander, Tuker and Freyberg. What is the debate, James?
Well, Tuker is absolutely brilliant. I mean, he's the best army commander that the British never had. He's commander of the 4th Indian Division who trained in mountain warfare, and he sees that he gets up there early. Alexander creates the New Zealand Corps, and the reason he puts Freyberg in charge is because Freyberg is the only 3-star general commanding a division, i.e. he's a lieutenant general rather than a major general. So he outranks everybody else. And there are sensitivities about using British Dominion troops. You've got to be careful. You can't just sort of, you can't humiliate someone like Freyberg by bringing someone in above him. So Tuker, that's fine because Tuker can tell him what to do. And Freyberg's not the sharpest tool in the shed, and he's one of these people who tends to be influenced by the last person he's spoken to. And again, that's fine if Tuker's around because he sees the situation very clearly and says what we need to do is we need to move inland further up the massif, cross over where it's wider, easier to maneuver. I mean, maybe higher, but that's not a problem because my troops are trained in mountain warfare. And we can get over that way, But the Monte Cassino Massif at the end is a fortress, and we're never going to get through it. We're going to be canalized by these ridge lines, and it's going to be disastrous. So Freyberg then tells this to the Americans who are there, the commander of the Red Bulls division, Dot Ryder, and Jeffrey Keyes, who's the 2-corps commander. That's the next one up on the chain of command. And they go, well, hang on a minute. We've just been battering our heads against this for kind of 10 days, 2 weeks. And you come here and think you've got all the answers. I'll have you know, we're really, really close to breaking through. You should just move into our positions and take over. So Freyberg goes, yeah, okay, well, we'll do that then. Unfortunately, Tuker at that crucial moment gets really, really ill. He gets rheumatoid arthritis and is debilitatingly so sent off to hospital. And so he manages to get himself out of his hospital bed to go and see Freyberg, and he says, "Look, if you're insisting on going against the Monte Cassino Massif, you're going to have to destroy the whole thing, and that's going to involve destroying the monastery as well, which is going to be a really, really bad PR exercise. It doesn't look good on us. We're supposed to be the liberators. And secondly, it needs to be absolutely pounded. I don't just mean the monastery. I mean the whole Monte Cassino Massif with the heaviest bombs we possibly can have. I'm talking about 4,000 pounders." bombers? And Freyberg goes, yes, 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 absolutely. And Tuker says, what I mean, absolutely insist on is you cannot have kitty bombers. These are single engine fighter bombers, dropping kind of 500 pounders. This needs to be the big boys. And Freyberg goes, yes, yes, yes. Tuker then goes back to his hospital bed. He follows up with two memos to kind of underline the point. Freyberg then goes to see Fifth Army headquarters, sees Al Grunter, who is Mark Clark's chief of staff, and says, I want 36 kitty bombers to hit the Monte Cassino Abbey, which is literally the opposite of what Tuker has told him to say. And Mark Clark, when he hears about this, thinks this is a terrible idea, which it is, and protests. But Alexander says, look, if we're asking a corps commander to do this job, we've got to give him the tools that he wants, and we've got to trust him. And if he feels this is how to do it, this is how we should do it. So Clark sort of shrugs his shoulders and goes, okay, well, you're the army group commander, but I think it's a terrible mistake. It goes ahead. It's completely an absolute catastrophe because it's not coordinated at all. The bombers come over without warning the infantry first. The infantry are barely in position. They haven't captured a key high point, which was a kind of prerequisite for launching the attack in the first place. And the whole thing is a complete catastrophe. And what they do is they target the monastery itself rather than the entire Monte Cassino massive. And the largest bomb they drop is a 1,000-pounder, and nearly all of them are 500-pounders. And it's a catastrophe. And
they do not, to my understanding, they do not seriously erode the Fallschirmjäger around the.
There's no evidence that a single German was killed in the bombing at all.
And the attack goes off. New Zealand launches its attack. The Indians, the India regiment, a very good outfit, Gurkhas, launch their attack, and they're cut up the way
the way the Red Bulls were. Yeah.
Red Bulls were cut up. And James, I want to emphasize, because I'm reading your very careful presentation from diaries and letters and memoirs of the units. All around these men who are attacking up this hill are dead bodies.
Yeah, it's awful because there's no real way of getting that. Occasionally they have little truces where they clear them up, but I mean, there's no way of going to get them, and they're just exposed on this bare rock. And put your head above the parapet literally is to kind of risk being sniped or shredded by a mortar shell or whatever. I mean, it's amazing because when you go up to Monte Cassino now, I mean, the whole of these ridge lines, Snake's Head Ridge and Phantom Ridge and so on, as they were called by the Americans, and then the rest of the Allies, they're covered in tiny stones and pebbles and rocks and stuff, all of which has been caused by shellfire 80 years ago.
The book is Cassino 44, The Brutal Battle for Rome. James Holland is the author. The Monte Cassino Monastery is destroyed. It's rubble. However, the Germans are not waiting to be simply penetrated at some point by the overwhelming American air and British forces. They counterattack. James is very clear throughout his very careful battle books that I've read that the Germans have almost a Pavlovian effect of whenever they're attacked, they counterattack right away. You can count on it. This is especially true in Normandy. The counterattack here is more organized. It's called Operation Fish Gang, and it means to drive the Sixth Corps into the sea. Von Mackensen leads it, and he's got a lot of heavy armor. James, I knew that there was going to be a happy outcome of this battle, but during the attack on the beachhead, I thought they were going to lose everything, and some of them did. The casualty rates, I've never seen anything like this. A unit going in with 190 men to approximate here and coming out with 12.
Yeah.
How did they hold together under those conditions?
Yeah, it's just amazing, isn't it? I mean, one is in awe of it, really. But fish fang. The problem with fish fang is it's much harder to attack than it is to defend. As the Allies have been discovering, and the Germans. The standard of training by this stage of war is pretty poor, and the attacks are not properly coordinated. They can make a big noise and a big steam, and they push the Allies back a little bit, particularly the British in the British sector, because they're covering the Via Ranzate, which is the main artery going down to Anzio and Nettuno and leading back up to the Via Appia, which you mentioned earlier on, Highway 7, which leads into Rome. So that's why they're going down that particular access. And I mean, there's a moment where there's a battalion in the 45th Thunderbirds division, an American division, where only 2 people get out. I mean, out of an entire company. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, and it's just incredibly brutal fighting. But the Germans can't push. They only push the Allies back so far, and it's not enough. And they expend a huge amount of effort, energy, weaponry, and of course manpower in achieving the small gains that they do achieve. They then do a further attack at the very end of February. It's a leap year that year, so on the 29th of February, and again that fails as well. And at that point, it's kind of game over for the Germans in terms of reducing the Anzio bridgehead. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And at that point, it just turns into kind of First World War trench warfare, really.
Now, the big thinking by the Allies is that this drains off German troops so that they can't be deployed with the Seventh Army and Rommel in Normandy. Is that a fact? Did it happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And they, because their attritional rates were so great, they kept having to reinforce the divisions they were being used, and bring in new divisions, and so they were constantly drawing away. They had, you have to remember by kind of spring of 1944, Germany's losing the war, and it's running out of manpower, and it's running out of fuel and oil and all the things you need to protract a long attritional war like this one, and they just don't have the time or the money or resources to be able to train people properly. And so the troops that are arriving at the front are in poor condition, not terribly well equipped, and it's just so much harder to attack, because attacking involves coordination and cooperation and instructing men to do things. When you're defending, you've just got to sit in a foxhole and just kind of keep firing that mortar or that machine gun or whatever. It takes some skill, but it's just not as complicated as attacking. And so the Germans Fishfang is a disaster for them, because the moment that fails, there is going to be no reversal in southern Italy. They are going to be ground down. The Allies are going to be able to break through the Gustav line, and they are going to use Anzio as a port of call for kind of breaking out. So it kind of dooms the German army defeat. It's not a matter of when it's going to happen. It's just kind of, on what scale and when is it going to happen, and what's the date it's going to happen, and what's the scale of the defeat. But the defeat is absolutely assured by the time the offensives around the bridgehead at Anzio fail.
Back at Wolf's Lair, the dictator continues to make the argument that when we drive them into the sea, meaning a fish gang, then what will happen? Or when we break them, then what will happen? What is he rationalizing his give no ground about? What does he think would happen?
Well, he thinks they'll be able to reduce the Anzio bridgehead. Then 14th Army will be able to come alongside 10th Army on the Gustav line. They'll launch a major counterattack and burst through and actually cause the Allies a massive reversal. But it's insane, because they don't have the resources to be able to pull that off.
And Kesselring doesn't tell him that?
No, because Kesselring's an optimist, and he always tries to look on the right side, and he thinks that is possible. But the reason he thinks that's possible is because he's a Luftwaffe field marshal, not an army field marshal, and he just doesn't know what he's talking about. And so again, every senior commander, including von Mackensen, the 14th Army commander that's trying to do these attacks at Anzio, knows they're doomed. I mean, they know what they're talking about, and they can see there is no way through. But still, they have to attack. Still, they have to hold the Gustav line. The only course available to them once Zeitensprung, which is the second half of Fishfang in the end of February, beginning of March, fails at Anzio, is to retreat to the Pisa Rimini line. But they just don't do it because Hitler won't allow Kesselring to do so.
Inside the destroyed Monte Cassino Monastery, there are chambers that cannot be reached even by 2,000 or 4,000 pound bombs. The fathers are extremely overwhelmed with villagers who fled inside the monastery from the bombing of the town and the region. There are horrible scenes of despair. Don Martino is my favorite because he survives. Now, what about the artwork? Had it already been removed? Because
Yes.
Germans had made a deal about that, I believe.
Yeah, so the Father Abbot wasn't sure whether he could trust the Germans, and there's no reason why he should think that. So he gave them a limited amount of art to safeguard, and they basically buried most of the rest of it. So a lot of the silverware and other stuff was buried or hidden safely in the within the monastery walls or just outside. But the Germans did take a lot of it, and actually, credit where credit's due, they did honor their agreement and safeguarded it, and to put it into safe places in Rome. But it's a terrible dilemma for the for the Father Abbot and for his charges, because they just didn't know whether they
They've
could trust
also been promised safe passage. It
him.
eventually happens, but I felt that it was not on purpose. It was just everybody was too numb to open fire on them.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Believes the parade down, and at some point they get transported to the Vatican. Is that what happens to them?
Yeah, basically. Yep. Yep. Yeah. But there's not very many left by this point. So it's not a huge burden on the Vatican by any stretch of the imagination. It's a terrible, terrible story. And one of the things is that, these monks, their lives are all built around a kind of very ascetic life of prayer and learning and farming for their own needs and looking after the local flock, etc. They're just not prepared for at all how to deal with this sudden calamity of finding themselves in the front line and having to deal with Germans, having to deal with allies, and having to deal with the fact that they're suddenly in the firing line, and ultimately that their monastery, their beloved monastery, is destroyed. And one of the great tragedies is trying to put yourself in the shoes of these monks and of the Father Abbot. He's trying to make the best call he can, but just feeling very, very ill-equipped to make that call. It's tragic.
Continuing the politics of Italy during the battle from the beginning of the boot all the way to where we are with Monte Cassino and the capture of Rome. There's a king, there are prime ministers, there are arguments, there are communists, there are resistance movement. And I cannot possibly describe the intricacies of the debate about who's in charge, the king must abdicate. So let's go to Elena and Paolo. They are active in the underground as it exists in Rome. Are they expecting the Allies any moment? What is their thinking as they begin to plan for a bombing?
Well, right from the word go, the moment the Germans move into Rome and in September 1943 and disarm the Italians, there is resistance, and they're part of the Action Group Party, or the Gapists as they're known, and it starts off with kind of minor sabotage and that sort of stuff, and it escalates into kind of shooting up Italian fascists and Germans and so on. And then there is this big bomb plot to attack a German police battalion by hiding a bomb in a dust cart, which goes off in the Via Rosella on the 23rd of March, 1944, and kills 130 SS police troops. And revenge on that is ferocious and brutal. But it's very, very important for people who want, young people who want to kind of rise up and fight. That there's pride at stake, there's freedom at stake, there's you're fighting against repression, etc., etc. And Paolo and Elena are lovers and compadres in this partisan group, and their bravery is extreme because, of course, being in the underground, you suspicion lies everywhere. You're always under the threat of betrayal. The conditions in Rome are pretty bad anyway, because there's not much food around and not much supplies and so on. So it's a very, very challenging time for them, and they're extraordinary people, because you don't have the support of an army or an army group or chiefs of staff or ocean going boats. In fact, you have no idea. You're a group of people who are outside the law in the place where you're existing, and you've just got to fend for yourself, and that adds a whole layer of difficulty and tension and, frankly, danger.
James tells a complete story. So Naples has been captured for some time. That is the R&R for many of these troops. It's also necessary to say that Italy is starving. And in Naples, it's clear that prostitution is the only way to feed families. In other parts of the country, the Allies and the Germans have cut through villages, destroyed churches, leveled people's lives. People have died with the shelling and the gunfire routinely. All of Italy is now a victim of these two armies battling each other. It's part of the story that isn't told when people are just reading about the battle. And James's contribution here is to give us a complete picture, not only of the Americans and the Brits and the people from India, the people from the Maori. There's a Maori battalion from New Zealand, but also the women and the children and the families who are destroyed as the Allies move through. And it makes it very clear that no war is fought between armies. War is fought on top of a civilian population that is helpless. Again and again, James, that's what your book does for me. Remind that committing yourself to battling on a place as crowded as Italy was at the time, all these villages, means that the civilians are going to die more than anyone else. Is that a lesson I can take from your book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Italy has a population of around 40 million in 1939, and not much less in 1944. And of course, most of those 40 million are living in the valleys, which is precisely the route for which the Allies are trying to advance and the Germans are trying to defend. So, in Cassino town is 100% destroyed. All the villages around about are 90% or plus destroyed. The scale of destruction is just appalling, and all the civilians caught up in the middle of this are just abandoned. They're abandoned materially, spiritually, physically. And they've just got to kind of make do. And there's no welfare state. There's no nothing. You're on your own. The fact that kind of sort of 50% of adult women in southern part of Italy have got some kind of sexually transmitted disease by March 1944 tells you everything you need to know. People don't go to prostitution for kicks and giggles. They do it because they're desperate, and it's just a terrible state of affairs.
And the Allies, though they control Italy up to Monte Cassino, do not provide sufficient food, as if I understand the government.
Well, the problem is they're trying to work out how to govern southern part of Italy, which is complex when it's been a fascist state up until this point, and there's been a king who is sort of effectively, doesn't want to abdicate power, but it sort of effectively has abdicated power by running out on his population when he fled Rome back in September 1943. So morally he's very suspect. I mean. There could have been enough food, but there isn't, because the Allies have set the exchange rate too high, and because the priority is winning at the front, not looking after the people at the back, et cetera, et cetera. There's any number of reasons why inflation is so high and why the Italians are starving. The other problem, of course, is that by a combination of Allied bombing and German destruction, a lot of the infrastructure has been destroyed as the Germans have retreated north. So that doesn't help either. If your electricity's down or your water mains is down or whatever, that also causes huge amounts of problems. So, and you can't just click your fingers and make it all right again. And it doesn't work like that.
At the same time, we need to get on to the battle for Rome, but Monte Cassino stands there still in German hands. The Gustav line is held, and the New Zealanders are going to make a third attack, and it's going to break down. And this is the time that they make the decision to destroy the town of Monte Cassino and send Allied troops into it to battle for more than a month in ruins. The book is Cassino 44, The Brutal Battle for Rome. Monte Cassino will not fall until, I believe, May. James, the Poles have a cemetery that I've seen a photograph of. I believe they were one of the last shock forces to be sent against Monte Cassino. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Yes, so the Polish Second Corps started arriving in Italy at the end of 1943 and into the first part of 1944, and really the being planned for Operation Diadem, which was the final battle for Rome, and which was overseen by Alexander, who wanted to kind of make the use of firm ground and better improved weather and longer days to kind of bring the first full weight of Allied fighter power and air power to bear, but also wanted to draw two armies together. Kind of so the bulk of the British Eighth Army was drawn up alongside the US Fifth Army, which is still under Mark Clark. And so Eighth Army took over the positions directly around Monte Cassino and Cassino Town, and they were all down in the valley, and clearing the Monte Cassino Massif is a mountain operation, and it's really an operation that needs to be fought in isolation. And because of the kind of language difficulties and all the rest of it, Oliver Leese, who was the new Eighth Army commander, decided to put the Poles up on Monte Cassino, although coached it in kind of cloaked it in words that suggested that this was the most incredible offer for General Anders, the two-corps commander, and wasn't he terribly proud and chest swelling at the prospect. Which, to a certain extent, he was, because all these Poles who fought there had been captured by the Soviet Union back in 1939, early 1940, because the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, while just after the Nazis invaded from the west, which, of course, kicks off the Second World War in the first place. And then they'd all been sent to gulags in the Arctic Circle. And then after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, they all started to be freed and told to kind of hurry southwards to kind of Uzbekistan, where they were all mustering. Trouble is, of course, that was 2,000 miles away, and they had to kind of get their way down there, and lots of disease and illness and all the rest of it. But those who survived that then were corralled together, taken across Iran into northern Iraq to a place called Kirkuk, and then into Palestine, which is now modern day Israel, and from there sent to Italy. And their very first battle they're involved with was the battle for Monte Cassino.
Not only the Poles are fighting for national pride, but the French, who were early on involved in the attack north of Monte Cassino, the same, taking casualties at an enormous rate, thinking all the time that they were in some way balancing out what had happened in their homeland. And one more, the Poles, the French, the New Zealanders, the Indians, and I was thinking of the Japanese Americans who were in a unit.
Nisei. Yeah. The 100th Nisei Battalion that were part of attached to the 34th Red Bulls. Yeah, I mean, it's a real polyglot force. And again, this is one of the extra challenges for Alexander and for Clark. They've got to deal with all these different nationalities, and
certainly some of them are enormously motivated at this point. You think to yourself, why would anybody crawl up a mountain in snowfall to have machine guns rattle over his head? Well, the esprit, there's no competition. They're all the same with different languages. Now, the town is destroyed on the 15th. I understand that. And they fight in the 15th, from the 15th on until it falls. At the same time, we have to get back to the big picture. The Germans are no longer able to control all the gunfire, and they're weakening. But there are things that have to happen before they launch the final assault on Rome. And one of them is the air operations to destroy bridges and gathering yards for the railroads. Why did they make that decision?
Well, because the Germans have got quite long lines of supply all the way from Germany down through the Alps, through the Brenner Pass, and then down to the front line on the Gustav line south of Rome. And so if you can destroy the railway lines, which carries the bulk of German supplies or roads or marshalling yards or whatever, then you're making it that much harder for the Germans to reinforce. And it's pretty successful, not decisively so at this stage, but it does cause a huge amount of headaches for the
That's Strangle, right? That's Operation Strangle, the air war. And it's very much like what happens in Normandy before the prep there, destroying, which was that point blank? I can't recall.
Yep.
So the Air Force has come into, had they already destroyed the German air, Big Week? Was that already gone by the time they launched?
Yes. Yeah, yeah. So they were by kind of the time of Operation Diadem, which is the last big battle for Rome, that involves the Poles and two armies and all the rest of it. Yes, the Luftwaffe has been pushed back over a large swathe of northwest Europe. The skies are dominated by the Allies in the run up to D-Day, and indeed, that does become a kind of a really decisive aspect of the whole
All right,
operation.
it's time to launch Operation Diadem. This is Alexander's plan, and it's a very good one. And if I understand right, he's going to use the deployment at Anzio, at Operation Shingle, to cut off the retreat route of
Yeah.
the Germans as they fall back and launch simultaneously. The British and the Americans are going to be launched against the AOK 4. They're attacking AOK Army 14, the 14th Army. That's the one they're attacking.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they're attacking both the 10th Army and the 14th Army. So the 10th Army is arraigned on the Gustav line around Cassino. The 14th Army is arraigned around 6th Corps at Anzio. So there's these two groups. But the idea for Diadem is to get to Rome, but also in the process destroy the German 10th Army. The net result of it is actually that they destroy the 14th Army and badly maul the 10th Army, which you could argue is overall a better result than had originally been conceived. And of course, they do finally take Rome. So it's Diadem is pretty successful. It just doesn't play out exactly as the plans had envisaged before they launched it.
Now, let's get back to the commander level because that becomes the politics of the moment. Churchill has been on the phone I get the sense that he calls every night saying, "When are you going to be in Rome? When are you going to be in Rome?" Why was that important to Churchill?
He was just obsessed with it. I mean, Churchill was a terrific historian, and he knew his Roman history, and he just wanted to get it. It was the kind of major capital of, probably after Paris and London and Berlin. It's probably the most famous capital in Europe, if not the world, and he just wanted to get his hands on it. But actually, from an Allied point of view, it wasn't Rome per se that was the issue. It was just pushing the Germans back. And the reason they wanted to push them back was to, keep the offensive spirit up against them, keep attriting the Germans, but also to give a really good safety buffer around the Foggia airfields, because originally it was conceived that there'd be 6 battle bombardment groups of 72 planes each at Foggia, but that had grown pretty quickly to 22 bomb groups by the spring of 1944. And so you really need a huge amount of Allied investment have been placed in the Foggia airfields. You need to look after them, and to do that, you need to have this cushion, and the cushion needs to be north or around Rome rather than south of it. So that's why it takes on this kind of huge importance for Churchill.
Did the mission of capturing Rome, did that in some fashion inhibit the Allies' decision making against the German army? Was Rome more important than destroying the Germans?
No. No, it absolutely wasn't. It's just that all roads lead to Rome, and you want to get into Rome so that you can then start pushing northwards again. The Via Appia that you mentioned earlier on, Highway 7 on the coast, and the Via Casalina, Highway 6, that also leads into Rome. The big thing is it was imagined that 8th Army going down the Liri Valley would be quicker than US 2 Corps and the French Expeditionary Force on their flank. So they were expecting that at a certain point they'd push the 10th Army down, the Germans would be squashed, and then at a certain key moment, 6th Corps from Anzio would break out, strike across the valley, across the flank of these mountains, and hit a town called Valmontone, through which the Highway 6 of Via Casalina runs. And behind that is another wall of mountains. So the idea was to try and trap the whole of the 10th Army. But as it turned out, not a single German soldier retreated down the Via Casalina, because the French and the US 2 Corps were far quicker going through the mountains on the flank of 8th Army than 8th Army were through the Liri Valley. And so the situation changed.
James Holland is the author. His new book is Cassino 44, The Brutal Battle for Rome. If you know James's work, all of these battles are integrated with all the other battles. And the one battle that's important hasn't happened yet. It's called Operation Overlord. It launches famously on the 6th of June. It's just a coincidence of fate that the 4th and 5th of June are when the Allies finally reach Rome, driving on Rome. You will recall that when FDR on the 6th made the announcement to the American people about the landings in Normandy, He said, "Last night when I talked to you, I knew about the landings." That was the speech that he made the night before about the capture of Rome. Now, the approach to Rome, as James laid out, is most direct with the Route 6. And Clark is making decisions all the time about capturing the retreating Germans and where to drive. He's especially concerned about too narrow a battlefront. What does that mean, James?
Well, his big concern is that he's got to go. The pre-Diadem plan is the launch of Operation Diadem, the Battle for Rome, is that at a certain point, Sixth Corps is going to break out of the Anzio bridgehead and kind of head straight across the valley with the Alban Hills on his left-hand flank, straight to this place called Valmontone, and cut off the retreating 10th Army. The problem is when he does that, he's now got the German 14th Army up in the hills looking down on him. And you don't really want to be advancing with your enemy overlooking your flank. So he does send troops to Valmontone, but he also reinforces Sixth Corps with extra divisions, not least the 36th Texas Division and the Red Bulls, who we met before down on the Gustav line, and who are now up at Anzio. And he turns in a broader front to turn and face the 14th Army and pushes on up through the Alban Hills. And Truscott, General Truscott, who is the Sixth Corps commander, is appalled at this because he thinks the most easy way to get to Rome is to push across the flanks and turn left at the Via Casalina. But Mark Clark is a broad front kind of guy, and personally, I remember kind of 20 odd years ago standing in that valley, looking up at the Alban Hills, thinking if I'd been Clark, I'd have been inclined to do exactly the same thing because, with an army looking down on your flanks, you're in big trouble. So he turns up and to start off with can't make any headway at all, and then it's actually the Texans who've had this traumatic experience on the Rapido back in January, who find a gap in the German line and are able to kind of push on up through the hills and exploit it. And at that point, it's kind of game over for 14th Army, and Clark is in his 5th Army is about to have the most extraordinary triumph of busting 14th Army and getting into Rome ahead of everybody else.
Yes, and 10th Army makes its escape to the north. I guess that's northeast.
Northeast. I mean, not a single 10th Army soldier retreats down the Via Casalina, which is what they'd predicted beforehand, but it just doesn't because, but they're very badly mauled as well. So Diadem is the biggest single victory of the Allies in the West until D-Day. There's no question about it. It's a huge victory. It's incredibly successful. 2 German armies completely hammered. 10th Army really, really badly mauled. 14th Army effectively destroyed for the time being. So that's a great result, and it happens the day before D-Day. I mean, really, Rome is in Allied hands by the 4th of June, but it's the 5th of June that Mark Clark arrives as the victorious army commander in that neck of the woods, and heads into the center of town and climbs the steps of the Campidoglio and hopes to get into the town hall, but it's locked, and so he ends up having a kind of meeting with his corps commanders outside on the kind of patio. But it's a great achievement, and at the time everyone is very full in their praise of him and what 5th Army and indeed 8th Army too have done. It's afterwards these rumors came about that if any British soldier was seen in Rome, Mark Clark had ordered them to be shot and stuff. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense. He never did anything of the sort, not least because he's got 2 British divisions in his army and fighting from Anzio, breaking out of the Anzio and heading into Rome. So that's just absolute nonsense. And my own view on this is that Mark Clark makes exactly the right decision, and that the criticism of him has been a retrospective one rather than one that was actually apparent at the time.
A note about how James works, because this is one of several books I've talked to James about, the testimony of the soldiers, and they're all through the book, are letters and diaries and memoirs. Some of the men survived, some didn't. And you have a report, James, about how you go to the cemeteries afterwards and find the graves of the men, some of the men that have been recorded. There are a lot of photographs of these men in the front of the book. Germans, Americans, all from all directions. This is a polyglot battle. And what it helps a deal, James, is the enmity disappears.
Yeah.
What is left is everybody in their own languages having the same horrible experience and wanting to get it over.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, some of the most moving testimonies are by Germans who find themselves caught up in this hell, and there's no escape, and it's just unspeakably bleak. And of course, worse for them in some ways is because they don't know what's going, whether their homes are still standing back home in Germany, being pounded every day by American and British bombers and so on. So it's an awful experience, and it's incredibly moving when there's people whose letters you've been following or diaries you've been following, and they get killed, and you find yourself sort of standing in front of their grave in the very, very beautiful British and Commonwealth cemetery outside Cassino. It's profoundly moving, and it's all the more moving knowing that we've got a European war going on at the moment, in Ukraine. So yeah, it's as though we never learn, isn't it?
I want to emphasize also in the reading of this book, I've said that there are parts that I just skipped. I could tell where we're going, the experience of a man who's arriving back at the front and finding people he left are gone. And then the experience of a man who turns around to look at someone he was just talking to and find him dead, even though he's just staring at him.
Yep.
Or rolling over a body and finding it horribly mangled. None of this is easy to read. It's not, but it does describe what they were experiencing. I'm amazed, James, afterwards that their thinking was as cogent as it was, because that amount of explosion around you is supposed to rattle your brain. Did they know about that at the time?
Well, they didn't know about things like PTSD, and they started to have increased understanding of combat fatigue, what we would call it battle stress or whatever, and much more sympathetic than they had been a generation earlier. A huge amount was expected of these young men, whatever side you're on. And it was just very brutal, compounded by the kind of terrible conditions in which they found themselves.
There was one of your informants who reasoned that a man only has so much courage in him. What did he say? It was like a well, and the well can run dry for a moment, and then you have to be considerate. I thought that was an extremely intelligent remark on his part.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely true. Yeah. You've only got so much. You need to top it up occasionally, and sometimes they were left at the front just a bit too long.
And they were crawling through a landscape at night. Sometimes they wouldn't sleep for 24 or 48 hours, and there was one unit that didn't have food for days.
Mm-hmm.
And the conditions were awful to begin with for both sides. And again, it's so striking. For some reason, this is worse to me reading than Sicily. Was it harder for you to write than Sicily?
Yeah, I think so. Just because, you get terribly involved with people's lives, and, particularly when you're reading diaries and letters, they don't know when Rome's going to fall. They don't know whether they're going to survive. They don't know when the war's going to end. And so you're so in the moment. And of course, the best diaries and the best letters, their characters reveal themselves very well. And you feel like you get to know these people, and, obviously you get to like them and empathize with them. And so when some of them don't make it through, it's very shocking and very upsetting. And, it's just, you're just sort of struck by the kind of terrible waste of it all. And yeah, it's tough. It's hard. It's not easy writing sometimes.
You've been to Monte Cassino. Is it entirely rebuilt?
Yeah, completely, absolutely, perfectly. Yeah, you'd never know. It's just extraordinary. It's a beautiful place to visit. I mean, the whole town is completely rebuilt because it was completely destroyed. The Monte Cassino massive itself is all sort of spruced up and tined up. But I mean, I was there, not so long ago, and I found a 75mm shell just like that.
The book is Cassino 44: The Brutal Battle for Rome. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.